Hey everybody, welcome to Parker Hill Church Online. I'm so glad that you set aside the time to join us as we reconnect with the heart of God and fill our minds with His words, and we really need that today. Hey, if you're watching this service by yourself, let me encourage you to invite a few other people to join you next time and create what we call a watch party, which is where you watch the service together, talk about it, and maybe even enjoy a meal together. We have a page on our website that explains how to host your own watch party. So check that out. Find your people and be the church wherever you are. Tell you, I've been hearing some great reports about some of the watch parties happening around northeastern Pennsylvania, and they are proving to be a really good experience. So take advantage of that. Later this week, I'll give you some more information about our plans to begin reopening our buildings. So be on the lookout for that. Well, throughout the summer, we're just making our way through one book of the Bible. It's the letter of James, and James was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, which of course is where the church started. And James wrote this letter to first century Christians who had been scattered by persecution. And there's a theme that's woven throughout this letter. It's the idea that real faith works. The real faith is not just something that's in your head, it's also in your life. It's not just a matter of what we believe, it's also a matter of how we behave. And today we come to a passage in this letter where James talks about the power of our words. Let me give you one simple phrase to summarize everything we're going to talk about today. It's this four-word phrase: our words have weight. We don't always realize that, but our words have weight. In fact, let me give you an example from history. After Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, his body was taken by train to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, and he was buried in a local cemetery. But then 22 years later, in 1887, his casket was taken out of the ground, it was opened up, and his body was inspected. Do you know why? Because words have weight. And a rumor was sweeping the country that his casket was empty, so they brought together a group of witnesses, opened his casket and confirmed that the body was there, and then the casket was sealed with lead and put back in the ground. But here's the amazing thing. It happened again 14 years later. By 1901, the same rumor had surfaced again, and the uproar was so great that the government went through the same process all over again. They had 23 witnesses this time, confirmed that his body was there, and then this time the casket was embedded in concrete 10 feet underground. You see, the tongue has amazing power, enough power to literally open a grave. Our words have weight. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21 says it this way. It says, the tongue has the power of life and death. The power of life and death. Words can bring life to a marriage and keep it strong, or words can kill a marriage. Words can bring families together, or words can drive families apart. Words can build a strong friendship, or words can kill that friendship. Our words can draw people toward God and toward the life that He offers them, and our words can turn people away from God. Like Proverbs says, words have the power of life and death. And some of you know this because you can still remember the words that were spoken to you so many years ago, words that had the power of life or had the power of death. Maybe just 3 or 4 words that were spoken to you by a parent, by a teacher, by a sibling, by a friend. And those words brought some life into you, or they brought some death into your world. Our words have weight. And as James begins chapter 3 here, he tells us to carefully consider the weight of our words. Begin here in verse 1 where he gives a warning, very interesting way to start this passage. He says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly." Not happy news if you're me. But notice this, it doesn't say not any of you should be teachers, it just says not many of you. And James is giving a warning about desiring to be in a position of influence, someone who teaches or leads or coaches other people. Because our words have weight, but they have even more weight when they come from someone in a position of authority. That's a sobering thought. But keep reading here in verse 2. He goes on to say this: we all stumble in many ways. In other words, we're all imperfect. We all screw up in lots of different ways. But then he says, anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. And his point is simply this: if you can control your tongue, everything else will be easy in comparison. Even though the tongue is a very small part of our body, it has a lot of power. And it can be very challenging to control that power and use it in the right ways. Now, before we go any further, something we need to keep in mind as we study this passage is that this was written to people who didn't have technology. For people living in the first century, almost all their communication was verbal communication. But we live in a very, very different world today. We live in a world where so much of our communication happens through email and text messages and social media. And I think we have even more trouble than they did in the first century controlling the words that come out of us, especially the words that flow through our fingers, even more so than the words that flow from our mouths. You know, some of the most damaging words that we speak are the words that we speak from behind a keyboard. I'm amazed at what people will say on social media and how destructive we can be, even as Christians. And I think if James were writing this letter today, he would talk about more than just the words we speak. He would talk about the words that we text and we tweet and we post and we share. And in the next 10 verses, James goes on to describe the power of our words. 3 kinds of power that our words possess. Number 1, our words have the power to direct. In other words, the words we use have the power to guide and direct other people. Our words have the power to steer people in the right direction or steer them in the wrong direction. And James makes this point using 2 examples beginning here in verse 3. He says, when we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. In other words, you can take something that weighs about a pound and put it in the mouth of a horse that weighs 750 pounds or 1,000 pounds, or if it's a Clydesdale, 2,000 pounds. And you can take that little piece of metal and attach it to leather straps called a bridle and reins, and you can make that horse go wherever you choose. And you can use that very small bit to steer that very large animal in any direction. Another example, verse 4, he says, or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. The rudder is found at the back of a ship. Most of it's below the surface of the water. You never really see it. And in comparison to the size of the ship itself, the rudder is extremely small. But the captain uses that very small rudder to steer that very large ship to the right destination. And James, after giving those 2 examples, goes on to say this, verse 5, likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. In other words, just like a very small bit controls the direction of a very large horse, just like a very small rudder controls the direction of a very large ship, your tongue can influence the direction of someone else's life. Great example of that from a woman named Helen Marosla. She was a math teacher. She taught high school math at a school in Minnesota. And she tells a story about a project that she did with her class one day. Let me just read what she wrote. She said, one Friday, things just didn't feel right. We had worked hard on a new concept all week, and I sensed that the students were frustrated with themselves and each other. So I asked them to list the names of the other students in the room on a sheet of paper, leaving a space between each name. Then I told them to think of the nicest thing they could say about each of their classmates and write it down. It took the remainder of the class time to finish the assignment, and as the students left the room, they handed me their papers. That Saturday, I wrote down the name of each student on a separate sheet of paper, and I listed what everyone else had said about that individual. On Monday, I gave each student their list. Okay? I never thought much about that assignment until a few years later. One of my former students, Mark Eklund, died at the age of 20 while serving in the Army. His parents asked me to attend his funeral service. After the service, Mark's mother and father approached me. We want to show you something, his father said, taking a wallet out of his pocket. They found this on Mark when he was killed. We thought you might recognize it. Opening the billfold, he carefully removed a worn piece of notebook paper that had obviously been taped, folded, and refolded many times. I knew without looking that the paper was the list of all the good things Mark's classmates had said about him. Thank you so much for doing that, Mark's mother said. As you can see, Mark treasured it. Mark's friends started to gather around us. Charlie smiled rather sheepishly and said, I still have my list. It's in the top drawer of my desk at home. John's wife said, John asked me to put his list in our wedding album. I have mine too, Marilyn said. It's in my diary. Then Vicky, another classmate, reached into her purse, took out her wallet, and showed her worn and frazzled list to the group. I carry this with me all the time, she said. I think we all saved our lists. You see, our words have power. The power to direct. Your words have the power to point people away from despair and toward hope. Your words can direct people toward God or away from God. Your words have the power to steer your marriage away from divorce and back toward intimacy. And sometimes all it takes is a few words to direct someone down the right path. And I'll tell you, there have been so many times when people have spoken words into my life that have directed my path or kept me on the right path. In fact, true confession. Every once in a while, somebody writes me a note that's so meaningful and so powerful that I take that note and I tuck it in a folder that I've kept in my office drawer for 30 years. And sometimes when I have a day when, my batteries are running low or I'm discouraged, one of those days when I just feel like quitting and getting a job at Dairy Queen and just giving ice cream to people all day because people smile at you when you give them ice cream. Sometimes on those days I just pull out that folder of letters that goes back 30 years and I read some of them again. And those words have a way of redirecting my spirit and getting me back on track. See, words have the power to direct. But here's the other side of that coin. Number two, our words have the power also to destroy. Our words have the power to inflict pain and to do great damage to people and relationships. Many of us know this because we've experienced it personally. Maybe it was a brother or sister and they just said some things to you and it's destroyed your relationship with them. You just don't speak anymore. Maybe you lost your marriage because of words that were spoken, words that destroyed the love and the intimacy of that relationship. Maybe you struggle with self-doubt and deep insecurities. And if you trace it all the way back to its source, you realize that it came from words that were spoken into your life. Our words have the power to destroy. In fact, James uses this very powerful word picture beginning at the end of verse 5. He says this, consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. Strong words. Do you guys remember those massive wildfires a couple of years ago in Northern California? Some of the worst wildfires in the history of that state. Almost 200,000 acres were burned. More than 8,000 buildings destroyed. 42 people lost their lives in those wildfires. But every one of those fires began with just one spark. And that one spark can lead to all kinds of destruction. I mean, think about this. This is a match, just a small piece of wood. I mean, I can easily snap it in half. Doesn't seem very powerful. But this small match can start a fire that can do a whole lot of damage. And the same is true with our words. You can burn down a marriage with words. You can burn down a relationship with your mom and dad with your words. You can burn down your relationship with your kids just with your words. You can burn down your career. You can burn down your future because our words have that much power. And one thing, that makes our words so damaging is that once you say them or write them or text them or post them, you can't get them back. And even if you apologize for those destructive words, right, they still stick, they still echo in the mind of that person who heard them. I like to think of it this way. Words can be like a tattoo. Once you have a tattoo, there's no easy way to get rid of it, right? You can't just erase it and start over. It might fade some over time, but it's pretty much always there. And sometimes people get tattoos that they end up regretting. Maybe they might get a tattoo on a whim without giving a lot of thought. They wake up the next day and they say, what have I done? Or they go to a tattoo artist who's just not very talented. In fact, this is a classic one. It says, never, don't give up, which I think means always give up. And I would say if you're a tattoo artist who doesn't have a good command of the English language, you should never don't give up on tattooing. Anyway, once you get a tattoo, it's there forever. And I mention that because I've always thought that's a pretty good metaphor to help us understand the power of the words we speak. Just because they're not tattooed on someone's skin doesn't mean that they're not still there. The words that we speak get tattooed on the hearts of other people, especially destructive words. And most of us, again, could probably give some examples of words that were spoken to us that have marked us in some way or another. And even if those words were spoken impulsively or carelessly or thoughtlessly by the other person, even if the other person who said those words apologized, you still carry them in your heart. Isn't that true? So words have the power to direct. They have the power to be destructive. They have destructive power. So in order to keep our words from being destructive, I think what we need are some filters. I want to talk about 4 filters that we need to have in place, that we ought to run everything through that we're about to say or text or tweet, okay? Filter number 1 is this one. Is this, what I'm about to say, is this true? I mean, this is first and foremost, right? If you know it's not true, don't say it. Or even if you're not sure it's true, if it's just like a rumor or hearsay, put that filter in place. Filter number 1, is this true? Filter number 2, is this helpful? In other words, even if it gets past that first filter, even if it's true, doesn't mean you should say it. You know, ask yourself, is this helpful? Why am I saying this? Our words should bring healing and bring life. Our words should build up and benefit those who listen. Is this helpful? What's my agenda in saying this? So number 1, is this true? Number 2, is this helpful? Number 3, is this the right recipient? In other words, are you talking to the person you should be talking to? A real simple example. Let's say you have an issue with someone. Here's my question. How many people should you talk to about that? The answer, 1. The person you had an issue with, not 6 other people whose hearts and minds are then affected by what you've just told them about this other person. And then filter number 4, is this loving? So, and this one kind of encompasses the first 3, right? I mean, if we love people, we're not going to say anything that's untrue. We're not going to say anything that's not helpful. We're not going to talk to the wrong people. But this goes even farther. This has to do with how we say what we need to say. Will it be gracious and humble? Will it give the other person the benefit of the doubt? Or will it be accusing and judgmental and sanctimonious and mean-spirited? You know, I hear this sometimes from people who say, you know, I just tell it like it is, which can actually be an excuse for saying something that's rude or hurtful or tactless. And so we got to have some filters in place. Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it the right person? Is it loving? Because words have the power to destroy. They have the power to direct, the power to destroy. And then number 3, our words have the power to diagnose. In other words, the words that we speak and write and text and tweet, those words have the power to diagnose the true condition of our hearts. Let me read now in verse 9. James writes this, with the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing, my brothers and sisters. This should not be. There's a level of hypocrisy here that he's addressing. And let's be honest, most of us have done this, right? You kneel down beside your child's bed to pray for him. And the next morning, with the same mouth, you scream at him. And one moment you're in church and you speak words of blessing to people, but then on the way home with the same mouth, you gossip about them. Why do we do that? Where does that come from? Well, James goes on to describe where it comes from. Verse 11, he says, can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. And James here is making a connection between the words we speak and the source of those words. He uses the picture of water and the spring that produces that water. He talks about a tree and the fruit that it produces. James really was echoing the words of his brother Jesus. In Luke chapter 6, Jesus said this when he was teaching one day. He said, no good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, An evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. The mouth speaks what the heart is full of. In other words, whatever comes out of my mouth is an indication of what's really going on inside my heart. If you have a problem with your tongue, it's a much bigger and more serious problem than you think. It's a problem with your heart. And I don't know if you've had one of those moments, I know I have, where you say something to someone and then you think to yourself, like, where did that come from? You ever have a moment like that? I mean, somebody pulls out in front of you in traffic and you just unload. And then a minute later you think, wow, where did that come from? Or you lose your temper with a coworker or with one of your kids, or you just say something to a friend that has an edge on it. And you think, wow, where did that come from? Jesus says, and James says also, I know where those words come from. They come from your heart. The mouth speaks what the heart is full of. And so Jesus says, listen, this ultimately is a heart issue. You change your heart and then you will change your words. Let me just give you a few examples, okay? A heart filled with entitlement speaks complaining words. A heart filled with gratitude speaks uplifting words. Do you know somebody who complains a lot? It's usually because there's a heart issue. They have a sense of entitlement. And so instead of looking at life and feeling grateful, they look at life and they say, I wish I had that. They have that, but I don't. It's unfair. When our hearts are filled with gratitude, though, we speak uplifting words. Here's another example. A heart filled with rejection speaks harsh words. And some of you have experienced this, right? Words of rejection were spoken into you, and it just comes out in the way that you speak to other people and about other people. But here's the other side of that. But a heart that's filled with acceptance speaks tender words. In other words, as you grow in understanding your understanding of how God has accepted you through Jesus, and that fills your heart, it'll come out in words of tenderness. Here's another one. A heart filled with self-righteousness speaks judgmental words. On the other hand, a heart filled with grace speaks compassionate words. As I remember the grace that's been given me from God through faith in His Son Jesus, as I fill my heart with that truth, it will change the way I speak. Another example, a heart filled with jealousy speaks words of gossip. A heart filled with contentment speaks words of blessing. Or a heart filled with pride speaks critical words, but a heart filled with love speaks encouraging words. You see, most of us put the attention on behavior modification rather than heart renovation. And there's a place for behavior modification. In fact, the Bible talks a lot about that. But if behavior modification, the way I speak, doesn't begin with a heart renovation, it just leads to frustration. And so what if we all decided this week that we're just going to be more intentional about monitoring what goes into our hearts? Maybe you just make some decisions about what goes in there. Maybe you spend less time feeding your mind and your heart on news media and social media and hours of mindless entertainment, and spend more time feeding your heart. Let's all do this, feeding our hearts with God's Word and listening to God's Spirit, because that change on the inside will eventually work its way out to the way that we speak, because our words have weight. Our words have the power to direct, to destroy, and the power to diagnose who we really are. Now, imagine what could happen if a few thousand people who call this their church would decide just to use their words to give life. What if all of us became very intentional about using the power of our words to bless the people around us? I mean, this could be a game changer in our families, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in our community. And listen, right now, especially right now, the world needs people who recognize the weight of our words and we use them with wisdom. Hey, if you're watching this message with a group of people, take a few minutes after we're done and talk about a few questions, okay? I'll just give them to you now and then you can have a conversation. Here's the first one. Describe a time when someone else's words affected you deeply, either positively or negatively. Something that's still in the back of your mind that you can remember, something that someone said to you that was so powerful, either negatively or positively, that you still remember it. Second question. Where do you struggle the most when it comes to using your words well? Maybe you're not very critical, but you're also not very encouraging. Maybe you struggle with gossip, or maybe you just struggle with, toning down the sarcasm. I don't know. Where do you struggle the most? And then third question, what one thing do you want to work on changing? It might be a change in your heart, or it might be a change in your habits. All right, looking forward to continuing this series in James next week. Stay with us right now as Steve comes back to wrap up our time together. Take care.